In the beginning, there was just water and sky, desert and dreams, a world before kings, before pyramids, and before those grand stone faces that would eventually gaze across time. The great river, not yet the sacred lifeline of divine rulers, was simply water carving its ancient path through endless sand. This marks civilization's first breath, drawn around 5000 BC, when the mighty floods deepened the valley each year, leaving behind the rich black earth that would become the bedrock of human greatness. In scattered villages along the riverbank, people learned to read the water's moods. When it would rise, when it would fall, when it would bring life or threaten to take it away. The great waterway was everything. It served as calendar and clock, highway and harvest, the thin green thread dividing the red desert from the fertile black earth. The folks who gathered along its banks called their land Kemet, meaning black territory, for the rich soil left after each flood. Beyond lay the Desert, the red territory, an ocean of sand stretching to the horizon. In these early days, before writing and history, communities grew slowly along the water's edge. At Nakane in the south and Buto in the north, settlements blossomed into towns, which in turn became centers of power. The people buried their dead facing west toward the setting sun, perhaps sensing that the realm of the dead lay somewhere beyond the desert's burning horizon. They painted pottery with images of boats carrying the deceased, animals both real and mythical, and dances celebrating festivals we can no longer name. These images whisper to us across 7,000 years, hinting at beliefs that would eventually crystallize into a complex religious system of divine rulers. Even then, they sensed the sacred in the everyday. In the ibis that foretold the flood, in the falcon soaring high above the valley, and in the bull whose strength could plow the black earth. Slowly, the scattered communities began to come together. In Upper Kemet, where the river ran between high cliffs, chieftains emerged wearing the white crown and ruling from Nakane. In Lower Kemet, where the great stream spread into a vast delta before meeting the sea, rulers donned the red crown and held court in the delta cities. These were two realms, two crowns, two ways of understanding the world, but both were children of the same sacred flow. For centuries, these two kingdoms existed in uneasy balance, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, always aware of each other across the sacred valley. The north was cosmopolitan, open to influences from across the Mediterranean, while the south was more conservative, a guardian of customs tracing back to the waterway's earliest children. Then came the monarch, whose name echoes through history like thunder across water, Narmer, later known to the Greeks as Menes, the unifier. Around 3100 BC, this southern ruler launched a campaign that would change the world forever. We see him on his victory pallet, a carved stone commemoration that ranks among humanity's earliest historical documents. The pallet shows Narmer in the white crown of Upper Kemet, striking down his enemies, and then in the red crown of Lower Kemet, a master of both territories. This unification was not just political, it was cosmic. By joining the two territories, Narmer became something unprecedented in human history, a divine monarch, a living deity embodying the harmony of opposites. He wore both crowns, commanded both peoples, and established a principle that would endure for 3,000 years. This realm was one territory under one ruler, blessed by divine forces and protected by the cosmic order they called Ma'at. At Memphis, where the two kingdoms met at the junction of valley and delta, Narmer, now calling himself Pharaoh, meaning great house, built his capital. It was a city that would outlast Rome, Babylon, and any other seat of power in the ancient world. Memphis became the heart of the realm, the place where north met south, where the administrative genius of divine monarchs first took shape. With unification came a burst of human creativity and organizational power that seems almost miraculous. Within centuries of Narmer's conquest, the people developed one of the world's first writing systems, hieroglyphs, sacred carvings that captured not just practical information, but poetry, prayer, and philosophy. They created a calendar based on the flood cycle and the stars' movements, dividing the year into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 sacred days believed to be the divine force's birthdays. The early sovereigns of the first and second dynasties established the template of divine kingship that would last for millennia. They were not just rulers. They were cosmic forces responsible for maintaining the balance between order and chaos, civilization and wilderness, life and death. When they died, they transformed, joining the sun deity Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. The tombs grew larger and more elaborate, reflecting not vanity, but deep religious conviction. At Saqqara, near Memphis, royal mastabas bench-shaped monuments of mud, brick, and stone housed not just the monarch's body, but everything he would need in the afterlife: food, furniture, even servants who were sometimes buried alive to accompany their master into eternity. These early dynasties set the rhythms of Kemetic civilization, the annual flood that brought both renewal and anxiety, the careful recording of grain harvests and tax collections, and the elaborate festivals that honored divine forces and reinforced the sovereign's sacred authority. They developed the concept of divine kingship to its logical extreme. The pharaoh was Horus, a falcon deity, while he lived and became Osiris, ruler of the dead, when he died. The legendary efficiency of the bureaucracy began to take shape. Scribes trained in the complex art of hieroglyphic writing formed the backbone of the state. They recorded everything: the height of the flood, the amount of grain in royal storehouses, the names of officials, and their duties. This realm became perhaps the world's first truly literate civilization, where the written word carried the power of divine decree. Trade networks extended up the great waterway into Nubia, bringing gold, ivory, and exotic animals to the royal court. Eastward, they reached into the Sinai Peninsula for turquoise and copper. Northward, across the Mediterranean, they established contact with the emerging civilizations of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The Black Territory was no isolated kingdom, but a confident power reaching out to touch the known world. The divine forces multiplied and organized themselves into a coherent pantheon. Ra, the sun deity, was supreme but distant. Ptah was the creator deity of Memphis, the patron of craftsmen. Thoth was the ibis-headed deity of wisdom and writing. Hathor was the cow goddess of love and music. And overseeing all was the concept of Maat, not just a goddess, but a principle, the divine order that kept the universe functioning and separated civilization from chaos. Religious festivals marked the year's passage. The Opid festival, when Amun would travel from Karnak to Luxor, would not emerge for centuries yet, but already the people understood that the divine forces needed to journey to be seen and to interact with their worshippers. The Hebsed festival, where the monarch renewed his divine power, may have begun in these early centuries, a ritual death and rebirth that allowed rulers to reign for decades while remaining eternally young. In cosmic terms, art found its distinctive style early, adopting a formal hieratic approach that would characterize sculpture and painting for 3 millennia. Figures stood in eternal poses, men with the left foot forward, women with feet together, both facing forward while their heads turned in profile. This was not primitive technique, but sophisticated theology made visible art aimed not to capture a moment, but to ensure eternity. The concept of the afterlife, which would become central to this civilization, began to take its final form. Death was not an ending, but a transformation, not a departure, but a journey to a realm where the deserving could live forever in perfect happiness. The mummy that most distinctive of all images emerged from these early experiments with preservation, a loving attempt to keep the body intact so the soul might recognize it in the next world. In the royal workshops of Memphis, craftsmen perfected techniques that would endure for millennia. They learned to work gold into intricate jewelry, to carve ivory into delicate figurines, and to shape stone with a precision that spoke of divine inspiration. The palette of Narmer itself showcases this artistic mastery. Every figure precisely carved, every symbol carefully placed, creating not just a record of victory, but a magical object ensuring the monarch's triumph throughout eternity. The early rulers had a deep understanding of power. It needed to be visible and tangible, both earthly and divine. Ruler Jir of the First Dynasty held grand funeral games where hundreds of retainers were laid to rest alongside him. Their bodies were arranged in neat rows around his tomb, like loyal courtiers attending their master's eternal slumber. These weren't acts of cruelty. They were expressions of cosmic order. In death, just like in life, the sovereign remained the focal point around which everything revolved. The great river itself became a subject of study, measured and predicted. Priests in Memphis started keeping meticulous records of the flood's height, noting which years brought plenty and which brought hardship. They uncovered the river's secret rhythm. It didn't rise randomly with the weather, but in sync with the stars. When Sirius, the dog star, appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn, the flood would follow within days. This was proof that heaven and earth were in harmony, that divine forces orchestrated the annual renewal. Language itself took on a sacred quality. The hieroglyphs, which began as simple pictures of bird for a bird, a house for a house, grew into something much more complex, a writing system that could express not just objects, but ideas, sounds, and abstract concepts. The scribes realized that symbols could represent not only what they depicted, but also what they sounded like. This sparked a fascinating interplay of ideograms and phonograms, making the writing both beautiful and wonderfully intricate. These early scribes, trained in temple and palace schools, became the memory keepers of the realm. They documented not just the day-to-day affairs of the state, but also timeless wisdom, guidelines for proper behavior, hymns to the divine, and tales of heroes and monsters. The instruction of Tehotep, though written later, carries wisdom that surely harks back to these early literate generations. Be skilled in speech so that you will succeed. The tongue of a person is their sword, and effective speech is stronger than all fighting. In the villages along the great river, life settled into rhythms that would last for 3,000 years. Farmers learned to read the water's moods, planting when the waters receded and harvesting before the next flood arrived. They invented the shaduf, a clever lever system that could lift water from the stream to irrigate fields beyond the flood's reach. They also domesticated sacred animals central to their religious practices: strong cattle for plowing, cats to guard grain from rats, and dogs to protect homes and accompany hunters into the desert. The villages themselves mirrored cosmic order. Houses faced north to catch the cool breeze. their flat roofs serving as workspaces and sleeping areas during the hot months. Streets aligned with cardinal directions, as if the earth itself were a sacred map. Markets buzzed with goods from across the known world: cedarwood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and gold from mysterious lands far up the river where black-skinned people mined the metal from granite hills. Religious practices blossomed and intertwined. The cow goddess Hathor, later cherished throughout the realm, likely originated from these early farming communities where cattle were vital for survival. The falcon deity Horus, protector of monarchs, surely arose from the all-desert dwellers felt watching these magnificent birds soar above the valley. Local deities, protective spirits of specific places, gradually formed a coherent pantheon as political unity called for religious harmony. The royal tombs at Abydos narrate their own story of evolving beliefs. The earliest were simple pit graves, distinguished from commoners' burials mainly by their size and the wealth of their grave goods. Over time, they became more elaborate, lined with wood, then brick, then stone, divided into chambers for various purposes, and surrounded by subsidiary burials of servants, pets, and treasured items. Each generation of tomb builders reached higher and dreamed bigger, as if sensing that their constructions were rehearsals for something magnificent yet to come. The sovereign's regalia crystallized into symbols that would endure for millennia. The double crown, merging the white crown of Upper Kemet with the red crown of Lower Kemet, declared his rule over both territories. The crook and flail, borrowed from shepherds and farmers, marked him as the guardian of his people. The false beard, tied on with ribbons, connected him to the divine forces, often depicted as bearded. The curious cobra on his brow promised death to enemies and protection to his subjects. Mystery cults began to form around certain deities. Osiris, the dying and resurrecting god who would become central to religious practice, may have already had followers in these early times. The myth explaining his death at the hands of his brother Seth, his dismemberment and scattering across the realm, and his resurrection through the love of his wife Isis, surely evolved from older stories about the annual death and rebirth of crops, reflecting the eternal struggle between order and chaos, fertility and sterility, life and death. Trade routes stretched like veins from the heartland to the south. Expeditions ventured up the great river beyond the first cataract into Nubia, returning with gold, ivory, ebony, and exotic animals for the royal menagerie. To the northeast, caravans crossed the Sinai Peninsula to bring back turquoise from ancient mines and copper from Timna. To the north, ships sailed the Mediterranean, establishing the first connections with the emerging civilizations of the Aegean and Anatolia. The bureaucracy that would become the hallmark of the realm began to take shape. Officials with titles that would last for millennia: Chief of the Royal Seal, Overseer of the Royal Treasury, High Priest of Ptah Set, of departments and procedures that brought order to an increasingly complex state. Provincial governors, tasked with tax collection and local administration, laid the groundwork for the famed administrative efficiency. By the end of the early dynastic period, around 2700 BC, this civilization had become unmistakably itself, a unified kingdom stretching from the first cataract to the Mediterranean, ruled by divine monarchs, sustained by the annual gift of life, organized by an increasingly sophisticated bureaucracy, and protected by the cosmic order Amat. But human ambition, once ignited, knows no limits. The rulers who inherited this carefully structured world would soon discover that stone and geometry, when combined just right, could reach the imperishable stars themselves. The Third Dynasty kicked off a monumental shift, literally carved in stone. Around 2670 BC, Djoser took the throne, but it was his architect, Imhotep, who would leave a lasting mark on history. Imhotep wasn't just a builder. He was a physician, astronomer, and a true visionary. He stood before Djoser with plans that turned royal burial traditions upside down. Gone were the days of simple mastabas. Instead, Djoser would ascend to the heavens on a grand stairway made of stone. At Saqqara, right across from Memphis, Imhotep began crafting something truly groundbreaking, a stepped monument soaring in 6 gigantic tiers toward the sky. Each level symbolized a step closer to the divine, a real-life ladder reaching up to the realm of the gods. Where the late ruler would join Ra in his solar bark, the step monument complex wasn't just a tomb. It was a miniature universe built from limestone. It had courtyards for the eternal celebration of the Heb-Sed festival, chambers stocked with goodies for the afterlife, and false doors allowing the sovereign spirit to wander between worlds. For the first time ever, someone dared to build eternity itself. But Imhotep's masterpiece was just the start. His innovations sparked an architectural craze that would take over the Fourth Dynasty, leading to incredible structures that still leave us in awe today, 4.5 millennia later. The challenge was set. Every new ruler had to aim higher, grander, and more perfectly than the last. The first king of the Fourth Dynasty took this challenge to heart, making it his obsession. Sneferu launched a construction spree so immense that it's hard to wrap your head around. At Medum, he finished a stepped monument started by his predecessor, but then he took it a step further by transforming it into the first true geometric pyramid, filling in the steps with smooth limestone. Unfortunately, the angles were off, and the weight distribution was a mess. Parts of it collapsed, earning it the nickname Collapsed Monument. Not one to give up, Sneferu headed north to Dashur and tried again. His second attempt shot up at a steep 54-degree angle, but halfway through, the builders realized they had made a mistake. The angle was too sharp, and the whole thing was at risk of collapsing. They adjusted mid-construction, lowering the angle to 43 degrees, which resulted in the iconic bent shape that gives the monument its name. Still not content, Sneferu commissioned a third pyramid at Dashur, the Red Pyramid, named for the reddish limestone at its core. Finally, the builders nailed it. The angles were just right, and the construction was spot on. The first true geometric pyramid stood proudly, its smooth sides reflecting the desert sun like a mountain shaped by divine hands. Sneferu's son inherited not just a throne, but a monumental challenge. How could anyone top the grandeur of his father's achievements? Khufu's answer would go down in history as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. At Giza, overlooking the ancient capital, Khufu's architects mapped out plans for a monument that would overshadow all others. For over 20 years, around 30,000 workers toiled to bring the Great Pyramid to life. They quarried massive limestone blocks, each weighing up to 15 tons, from the Giza Plateau. The finest white limestone came from Tura, across the waterway, transported by barges during the annual floods. Granite for the inner chambers journeyed 600 miles from Aswan, with enormous blocks requiring specially built vessels to move. The precision of the Great Pyramid is almost otherworldly. Its base spans 13 acres and is level to within just 2 centimeters. The 4 sides align nearly perfectly with the cardinal directions, deviating by only 3 arc minutes. The original height of the monument was 481 feet. and its base related to the mathematical constant pi, though whether this was by design or chance remains one of Egyptology's enduring puzzles. Inside, the architects crafted a maze of chambers and passageways that catered to both practical needs and cosmic symbolism. The descending passage dives into the bedrock toward an unfinished subterranean chamber, possibly the original burial site that was abandoned when plans shifted. The ascending passage leads to the Grand Gallery, a soaring corridor with a corbelled ceiling that ranks among the ancient architectural marvels. At the end lies the royal chamber, made entirely of red granite and housing a massive sarcophagus that was placed there during construction. It was too large to fit through the passages once the pyramid was finished. The Great Pyramid wasn't just Khufu's tomb. It was the heart of a whole necropolis. This complex featured a mortuary temple where daily offerings were made to honor the deceased ruler's spirit. There was also a causeway linking the pyramid to a valley temple where mummification rituals took place, along with smaller pyramids for Khufu's queens surrounding the main structure. Hundreds of mastaba tombs housed the nobles and officials who would serve their king in the afterlife, creating a bustling, eternal city of the dead. But even Khufu's incredible feat didn't fully satisfy the ambitious spirit of the Fourth Dynasty. His son Khafor took on the challenge, building the second pyramid at Giza. It's slightly smaller than his father's, but it looks taller because it's perched on higher ground. Khafor also commissioned the Great Sphinx, which was carved from a massive limestone outcrop left over from his father's quarrying. With the body of a lion and the head of a ruler, the Sphinx symbolizes divine leadership blending human wisdom with the strength of the fiercest predator. Menkaure, Khafor's successor, rounded out the Giza trilogy with a third pyramid. Though smaller than the others, it was crafted with just as much care. By this point, the hefty costs of these projects were starting to stretch even the resources of the most powerful state on Earth. The royal pyramid remained impressive, but the overall complex became simpler, with less elaborate subsidiary buildings. Contrary to popular belief, these monumental structures weren't built by slaves. Recent archaeological discoveries from the workers' villages at Giza show that the laborers were well-fed craftsmen, likely conscripted during the flood season when farming was impossible. They enjoyed a diet rich in beef, bread, and beer, something that reflects their valued status rather than oppression. Graffiti left by work gangs proudly displays names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, suggesting a real sense of pride in their monumental work. The pyramid complexes operated as economic engines, employing thousands of people year-round. Priests conducted daily rituals, offering food and incense to the deceased ruler's spirit. Craftsmen crafted the furniture, jewelry, and provisions needed for the afterlife, while farmers on royal estates supplied the agricultural surplus that funded these activities. These monuments were not just signs of royal vanity. They were vital religious and economic institutions that supported entire communities during this golden age. Divine leadership reached its peak during this time. The sovereign was more than just a ruler. They were seen as a cosmic principle, the living embodiment of Horus, who would transform into Osiris upon death. The pyramid texts, first carved in the burial chamber of Unas at the end of the Fifth Dynasty, captured the religious beliefs that fueled these monuments. They described the deceased ruler ascending to the heavens, joining the everlasting stars, and becoming one with Ra on his eternal journey across the sky. The nobles who surrounded these divine leaders built their own elaborate tombs, creating an art form that would influence civilization for millennia. The mastaba tombs at Saqqara and Giza are adorned with scenes of daily life, rendered in stunning detail. Farmers harvesting grain, fishermen casting nets, craftsmen at their benches, and dancers and musicians entertaining guests at banquets. These images weren't just decoration. They were magical insurance, ensuring that the deceased would enjoy these pleasures for all eternity. Women held a remarkable status during the Old Kingdom. Queen Hedefires, Khufu's mother, was buried with exquisite furniture and jewelry. The gold work found in her tomb showcases a level of artistic achievement that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Other royal women, like Queen Kentkaus, may have even ruled in their own right during transitional periods between dynasties. The administrative system that supported this monumental age was incredibly efficient. The Abusir papyri, discovered in the complex of a 5th dynasty pharaoh, provide some of the earliest substantial administrative records from ancient times. They reveal a bureaucracy of remarkable sophistication, tracking everything from daily rations for temple workers to the movements of ships carrying stone from distant quarries. Officials with titles like Overseer of all Royal Works and Chief Architect managed resources that dwarfed those of most contemporary kingdoms. Science and mathematics thrived alongside architecture. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, although copied much later, preserves medical knowledge that likely dates back to this period, offering the first systematic descriptions of surgical procedures, anatomical observations, and rational medical thinking. The Rhind Papyrus showcases mathematical concepts, including the beginnings of geometry and algebra, which the pyramid builders must have mastered to achieve their architectural wonders. Trade networks expanded to support these construction efforts. Cedar wood from Lebanon provided timber for boats and scaffolding. Gold from Nubia funded the vast expenses. Copper from Sinai was combined with tin to create bronze tools, allowing for precise stone cutting. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan adorned royal jewelry, while incense from Punt added fragrance to temple rituals. During this period, religious concepts crystallized that would remain central to belief for 3,000 years. The sun deity Hara emerged as the supreme divine force, a creator and sustainer of all life. It was believed that the deceased ruler would join Rhea's crew on the solar bark, helping to fend off the serpent Apophis, who threatened to devour the sun each night. This daily cosmic drama was reflected in the orientation of temples and pyramids, strategically aligned to catch the first rays of dawn. However, even the mightiest kingdoms can sow the seeds of their own decline. The enormous resources devoted to monumental construction gradually weakened the central government. Wealthy provincial governors began to assert more independence as they managed royal estates. The ideology of divine leadership, taken to its logical extreme, ironically weakened royal power by making the sovereign too sacred for effective political action. The 5th dynasty marked the start of this slow decline. The stone pyramids became smaller, and construction quality diminished. Solar temples dedicated to Ra began to compete with royal tombs for resources and attention. While the divine ruler was still revered, power gradually shifted toward the priesthood and provincial nobility. Pepi II, who took the throne as a child around 2278 BC, would rule for an astonishing 94 years, the longest reign in human history. But this longevity proved to be a curse rather than a blessing. As the aging sovereign became increasingly isolated in his palace, real power shifted to regional governors who ruled their provinces like independent kingdoms. The central government, weakened by decades of massive construction projects and lavish court life, struggled to maintain authority over distant territories. To make matters worse, climate change added to the political turmoil. The annual flood, the lifeblood of prosperity, began to fail. Drought swept through the region, causing famine and social unrest. Provincial governors hoarded grain, while the central government proved powerless to redistribute resources effectively. The unified realm that had stood for over 5 centuries began to splinter. The collapse didn't come with fire and sword. It happened quietly, with water just not rising. For 7 years straight, the life-giving floods barely touched the banks of the great waterway. Fields that had thrived for millennia turned to dust. Granaries, built to weather normal lean years, emptied out and stayed that way. The divine order that had held civilization together for 8 centuries cracked like sun-baked clay. In the villages, people began to die, first the elderly, then the children, and finally the strong young farmers who always seemed as eternal as the monuments themselves. The provincial governors, who had grown fat off the tribute that once flowed to Memphis, hoarded what little grain was left. Trade routes dried up as merchants found nothing to buy and no one to pay. Bureaucrats who had meticulously recorded every basket of wheat and every jar of oil suddenly found themselves with nothing left to count. Memphis, the eternal capital, became a ghost town. The grand palace where divine rulers had held court for centuries echoed with the footsteps of servants, who would soon abandon their posts. The workshops that once created treasures for royal tombs fell silent. The priests who had maintained daily rituals in temple after temple found their altars bare of offerings. Even the gods seemed to have abandoned their chosen people. But nature's cruelty only revealed the deeper rot spreading through the kingdom's foundations. The old kingdom hadn't just collapsed, it had devoured itself. Decades of monumental construction drained the treasury, leaving no reserves for a crisis. The ideology of divine leadership had become so rigid that rulers could no longer adapt to changing circumstances. Most fatally, power had shifted away from the center to regional strongmen who owed their positions to royal favor but felt no loyalty to royal authority. When the central government finally vanished, these provincial governors simply declared themselves independent rulers. The unified realm shattered into dozens of petty kingdoms, each controlling a few districts along the waterway. They fought constant wars over irrigation rights, trade routes, and the dwindling resources of a land in crisis. Some called themselves pharaohs, commissioning crude monuments and pathetic imitations of royal regalia. Others dropped all pretense and ruled as simple warlords. The sacred order that had made civilization possible evaporated. But the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and harmony seemed to have fled the world entirely. Ancient texts from this period captured the horror of those who lived through civilization's collapse. The land spins around as does a potter's wheel. Towns are destroyed. Upper Kemet has become a wasteland. Crocodiles gorge on the fish they have caught, and people go to them of their own accord. Even more shocking than the political chaos was the social revolution. The rigid hierarchies that had defined society for centuries dissolved overnight. Servants claimed their master's property. Peasants wore fine linen, while nobles dressed in rags. The careful burial customs that had separated rich from poor disappeared. Surviving communities could barely afford to bury their dead at all, let alone with the elaborate provisions that had once guaranteed eternal comfort. Yet in this apparent ending lay the seeds of rebirth. The collapse of central authority forced local communities to become self-reliant in ways they had never been before. Village councils learned to make decisions without royal approval. Local craftsmen developed new techniques when luxury materials became unavailable. Farmers experimented with new crops and irrigation methods when the old systems failed. The catastrophe that destroyed the old order also unleashed human creativity on an unprecedented scale. Writing itself was democratized. Hieroglyphic literacy, once the exclusive domain of royal scribes, spread to provincial officials and local priests who needed to keep track of their own affairs. More revolutionary was the development of hieratic script, a simplified cursive form of hieroglyphs that could be quickly written on papyrus or pottery shards. For the first time, ordinary people could learn to read and write. Religious beliefs underwent their own transformation. The coffin texts, magical spells that had once been carved only in royal burial chambers, began appearing in the tombs of provincial nobles and wealthy merchants. Death and resurrection, previously the exclusive privilege of divine rulers, became accessible to anyone who could afford proper mummification and burial equipment. They could hope to join Osiris in the blessed afterlife. Literature flourished as scribes recorded not royal propaganda, but their own experiences of living through apocalyptic times. The prophecy of Nefertiti described the land turned upside down, where brothers will fight brothers, and the children will kill their parents. The dialogue of a man with his soul explored the meaning of life when all traditional certainties had vanished. These works reveal a sophisticated philosophical thinking that the rigid conventions of the Old Kingdom had never permitted. For nearly a century and a half, this chaotic new world persisted. Dozens of rulers calling themselves pharaohs ruled territories no larger than individual provinces of the former kingdom. Some lasted years, others just months before falling to rivals or succumbing to the ongoing environmental crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests that many regions were virtually abandoned as populations fled to areas where water and food remained available. But gradually, stronger powers emerged from the confusion. In Heracleopolis, north of Thebes, a family of rulers calling themselves the 9th and 10th dynasties managed to control substantial territory in the middle and lower regions. They restored some administrative efficiency, rebuilt irrigation systems, and even commissioned modest monuments in imitation of their great predecessors. More significantly, a noble family in Thebes would eventually reunify the entire realm. These 11th dynasty rulers started as simple provincial governors, but had something their rivals lacked: a coherent vision of what restoration meant. They understood that reunification required not just military conquest, but also the reconstruction of the administrative, religious, and cultural systems that had made the Old Kingdom great. Intef II, the greatest of the Theban rulers, spent 50 years slowly extending his authority northward. Unlike the warlords who had dominated the intermediate period, he campaigned not merely to conquer territory, but to restore the ancient systems of governance. As each district submitted to his authority, he appointed competent administrators, rebuilt temples, restored irrigation networks, and re-established the trade connections that brought prosperity. The final battle came at Heracleopolis, where the last of the northern dynasties made their stand. When the city fell, Intef II stood as the undisputed master of the entire waterway from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean. For the first time in over a century, the two lands were truly united under a single ruler. The Middle Kingdom had begun, but this restoration was no simple return to old ways. The traumatic experience of collapse had changed everything. The new rulers understood that divine authority alone was not enough. Effective government required capable administrators, loyal armies, and genuine support from local communities. They created a more flexible system that combined central control with regional autonomy. The 12th dynasty, starting with Amenhotep I, moved the capital north to a new city called Itztai, Caesar of the Two Lands, strategically located between Memphis and the Fayum oasis. From here, they could control both the traditional heartland and the newly developed agricultural regions that would fund the kingdom's renaissance. Amenhotep I ruled for 30 years, but met a violent end that shocked the realm. His assassination, apparently by palace conspirators, showed that even successful rulers remained vulnerable to the ambitions of rivals. Before his death, he wrote the instructions of Amenhotep, a bitter testament warning his son to trust no brother, know no friend, make no intimate. The optimism of the old kingdom, when pharaohs were unquestioned gods, had given way to a more cynical understanding of power's limitations. His son Senuserdai really took the lesson to heart. He ruled for 45 years, pushing the kingdom's borders deep into Nubia, while keeping a close eye on potential rivals back home. The massive fortress he built at Bon, way up the waterway past the Second Cataract, showed off the new military vibe of the Middle Kingdom. These rulers weren't just sitting in their palaces. They were out there actively expanding their territory and making sure their borders were secure. Senusret III, the top military leader of the dynasty, took it even further south, setting up a fortified frontier at Semna, beyond the Second Cataract. His message was pretty clear and a bit intimidating. He, my son, who maintains this frontier I've built, he is my son. But he who abandons it and doesn't fight for it, he is not my son. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs understood something their old kingdom predecessors had forgotten. Power needs constant attention and sometimes a bit of force to keep it. They were divine rulers, sure, but they were also savvy politicians who couldn't just hide away in sacred isolation. They led their armies into battle, oversaw major construction projects, and kept close ties with provincial governors to prevent any dangerous independence. Under these conditions, literature and art really thrived. The story of Senu, the standout tale of the Middle Kingdom, follows a court official who runs away after Amenhotep I's assassination, but eventually returns to find redemption and royal favor. It dives deep into human psychology and the complexities of politics in a way that earlier propaganda just couldn't touch. Religious changes were significant too. Amun, once a minor deity from Thebes, began to rise as the supreme god of the realm. His priests, thankful for the success of the Theban dynasty, spread his worship throughout the newly unified kingdom. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, Amun had merged with Ra, becoming Amun-Ra, the king of the gods and patron of pharaohs. The irrigation systems developed during this time changed agriculture forever. The Fayum oasis, southwest of Memphis, transformed from a swamp into the kingdom's most productive farming area thanks to a clever network of canals and dikes. Similar projects across the valley boosted agricultural production and supported larger populations than ever before. But maybe the biggest change was social. The strict class distinctions of the old kingdom faded away, allowing for more mobility and opportunity. Provincial families could rise to high office based on merit instead of just birth. Skilled craftsmen and scribes formed a real middle class with their own cultural traditions and economic interests. Even farmers found more security as new administrative systems offered better protection against famine and oppression. For over 2 centuries, this revitalized kingdom thrived. Trade networks stretched into Nubia for gold, the Levant for cedarwood and luxury goods, and across the Red Sea to the mysterious land of Punt for incense and exotic animals. The capital at Ichtai became a melting pot where foreign merchants and diplomats mingled with local officials and priests. But with success came its own risks. As the Middle Kingdom grew rich and secure, its rulers started to lose the military edge that had made reunification possible. The 13th dynasty produced capable administrators, but lacked great warriors. Provincial governors, getting comfy in their hereditary roles, began to focus more on local interests than royal commands. Most concerning was that the kingdom's very success attracted new people to its borders. In the Delta, Asiatic traders and craftsmen set up permanent settlements. At first, these newcomers seemed like a blessing. They brought new technologies and trade connections that boosted prosperity. But as their numbers grew and their communities became more established, they started developing their own political ambitions. The great waterway that once shielded the realm from foreign threats now carried new dangers toward its heart. The age of isolation was fading, though not many realized it yet. The kingdom that had risen from chaos was about to face challenges that would truly test whether any lessons had been learned from the catastrophe that nearly wiped out civilization itself. The great waterway that once connected a powerful realm now split a fractured land. By the 17th century BC, the restoration efforts by Amenhotep III's successors were already starting to fade. The 13th dynasty saw over 60 rulers come and go in just a little over a century, a lineup of forgotten names, each barely managing to etch their cartouche before vanishing into history. Up north, around Memphis and the lush floodplains, a shadowy administration popped up, known as the 14th dynasty, if you can even call it that. It was basically a bunch of local strongmen controlling individual cities or small areas. They had royal titles but no armies, no trade routes, and no real legitimacy beyond their own little settlements. What was once a unified state that thrived for over 1,000 years had turned into a patchwork of petty territories. Then, into this chaos stepped some newcomers from the east. They called themselves Hyksos, meaning rulers of foreign lands, but history remembers them as the Hyksos. These weren't the barbaric hordes you might picture. They were actually sophisticated folks from the Levant traders and craftsmen who had been trickling into the northern regions for ages. What really shook things up wasn't their culture, but their tech. They brought the horse with them. For 3,000 years, the strongest army in the known world was made up of infantry, wielding copper weapons and simple bows. Chariots? No, they were unheard of, and cavalry was just a wild idea. The Hyksos invaders changed the game of warfare forever. Their horse-drawn chariots, equipped with composite bows that could pierce armor from distances local archers couldn't even dream of, turned the battlefield into a deadly zone where being quick meant survival and sticking to tradition could mean doom. When the invasion hit, it wasn't the grand spectacle that later tales would have you believe. No epic battles decided the fate of lands. Instead, Asiatic chiefs simply declared themselves the masters of regions that had no real defenders. Local folks, worn out from years of civil strife and administrative mess, often welcomed these new rulers who promised order and prosperity. Salatis, the first foreign chieftain to claim control over Lower Kemet, set up his capital at Avaris in the eastern floodplains. This was a bustling trade hub where Syrian merchants had done business for generations, creating a vibrant city where traditional temples stood alongside Canaanite shrines, and local artisans picked up new skills from foreign techniques. It was a wild mix of the old and the new, something that would have shocked the builders of the pyramids at Giza. The cultural shift was just as significant as the military one. Bronze took over from copper in tools and weapons. The potter's wheel, which had been known but rarely used, became standard in workshops all over the north. New crops like pomegranates, olive trees, and horse fodder changed the agricultural scene. Even music got a makeover, with Asiatic lyres and lutes joining the traditional harps and flutes in temple orchestras. But the Hyksos faced a big problem that would ultimately lead to their downfall. They could conquer the north, but they could never really govern it. The bureaucratic traditions, religious practices, and the whole idea of divine leadership that made administration work in this land felt foreign to them. They took on traditional titles, commissioned monuments in ancient styles, and even learned to write hieroglyphs. But they were still outsiders trying to master a civilization whose core beliefs they couldn't fully understand. Meanwhile, in Thebes, far up the sacred waterway, where foreign chariots couldn't easily reach, the ancient nobility sat back and watched. The descendants of the Middle Kingdom kept up the pretense that they were the legitimate rulers of all territories, even though their authority barely stretched beyond the city walls. They called themselves the 17th dynasty and performed ancient rituals in dwindling temples, keeping the memory of unified governance alive. For over a century, this uneasy balance continued. The Hyksos controlled the rich northern lands and the trade routes to Asia, while Theban rulers held on to traditional authority in the south. In between, local chieftains carved out small domains, shifting alliances as needed. It was a time of cultural blossoming and political fragmentation, where new ideas flowed freely, but no single authority could impose order on the chaos. Then came a message that would spark a war lasting generations. Apophis, the mightiest of the foreign overlords, sent an embassy to Thebes with an outrageous demand. He claimed the hippopotamuses in the sacred pool of the Theban palace were keeping him awake at night with their roaring. Despite the 600 miles that separated Avaris from Thebes, the message was clearly an insult, a deliberate jab meant to force the Theban ruler into a humiliating acknowledgement of foreign supremacy. Sikenenj-Dao, the Theban chieftain, chose war instead. The archaeological evidence of his choice is chilling. Sikenenj-Dao's mummy shows the wounds that killed him. His skull was crushed by a foreign battle axe, his jaw shattered by a mace, and his neck pierced by a dagger. He died a violent death, likely in battle, becoming the first casualty of a liberation war that would consume 3 generations. His son, Kamose, inherited both the throne and the vendetta. The young leader launched campaigns against Hyksos positions, pushing north from Thebes with a fleet of war boats. His victory stela, found at Karnak, preserves his own words about destroying Asiatic settlements. I sailed north to drive out the foreigners by the command of Amun, my courage being firm against them. But my army was like lions with their prey, slaves, cattle, milk, fat, and honey, dividing up their possessions. But Kamose's efforts, though successful, were just raids. He could strike at foreign territories and then pull back, but he didn't have the resources to hold on to conquered land. The core problem remained: how could a southern territory, cut off from the Mediterranean trade that had always been the source of royal wealth, hope to defeat enemies who controlled the richest regions and had superior military tech? The answer came with Kamos's younger brother, Ahmose, who would become the founder of a truly glorious age in ancient history. Ahmose realized that beating the invaders meant becoming like them. He adopted their military innovations, chariots, composite bows, and bronze weapons, while still holding on to the religious and administrative traditions that gave his rule legitimacy. More importantly, he understood that the war couldn't be won through raids. It had to be about systematic conquest and completely dismantling foreign authority. The siege of Avaris became the defining moment of the Liberation War. For years, Ahmose's forces surrounded the Hyksos capital, cutting off trade routes and supplies. Inside the city, Asiatic families, who had lived in the northern territories for generations, faced a terrible choice: flee back to their ancestral lands in the Levant, or risk the wrath of the returning traditional forces. When Avaris finally fell, Ahmose's treatment of the defeated population set the tone for the new age that was dawning. Unlike previous conquerors, who were fine with ruling through local allies, he expelled the Hyksos leadership entirely, chasing them even into their Palestinian stronghold to ensure they could never come back. The message was clear: alien dominance would never again be tolerated in the Sacred Valley. But this victory brought some unexpected consequences. The armies that had learned to fight in foreign lands discovered that conquest could be quite rewarding. The weapons designed to kick out invaders turned out to be just as effective at building an empire. The administrative skills developed to manage a reunified state could handle distant provinces as easily as local districts. The pharaoh, who started as a defender of ancient traditions, found himself at the helm of an imperial age. The chariots that had once threatened Thebes now carried traditional warriors beyond their ancestral borders into Nubia and the Levant, creating an empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract to the Euphrates. The Hyksos period, traumatic as it was, transformed everything. The isolated territory that once thought of itself as the center of a static universe had become an aggressive imperial force, confident in its military strength and determined never to face the humiliation of foreign rule again. The weapons, tactics, and technologies learned from their enemies made the ancient realm stronger than it had ever been. As Ahmose stood in the ruins of Avaris, surrounded by the spoils of victory, he could hardly have imagined that he had unleashed forces that would make his successors the most formidable rulers on earth. The age of isolation was ending. The age of empire was just about to kick off. The victory at Avaris wasn't just a military win. It was a game changer. Ahmose kicked off his reign fighting to kick out foreign invaders, but he wrapped it up as a conqueror of far-off lands. What started as a defensive war to drive out the Hyksos turned into an offensive push that took traditional forces deep into Nubia and the Levant. By the time he passed away around 1525 B.C., the once isolated valley civilization had morphed into an aggressive, expansionist power stretching from the Fourth Cataract all the way to the borders of Mesopotamia. His son, Amenhotep I, built on these early victories. But it was the third ruler of the 18th dynasty who really set the stage for international greatness. Thutmose I, who came to power through marriage instead of birth, felt he had to prove his worth through military success. His campaigns went further than anyone else's before him, south beyond the Third Cataract into the heart of Nubia, and north across the Euphrates into the Mitanni region. At Tumbos, near the Third Cataract, Thutmose carved an inscription that captured this new mindset of expansion. "I have made the boundaries of my dominion as far as that which the sun encircles. These Rulers were no longer satisfied with just the sacred valley. They claimed dominion over the entire known world. A cautious approach of earlier times gave way to an unquenchable thirst for more, supported by military tech that made those dreams possible. But the most fascinating leader of this early expansionist age didn't fit the typical mold. When Thutmose II died young, leaving behind a young son, his main wife took the reins with traditional female authority. What set Hatshepsut apart wasn't just that she ruled as regent royal women had done that before, but that she gradually transformed herself into something completely new, a female pharaoh. This change was subtle, almost sneaky. Early inscriptions show her standing behind the young Thutmose III, clearly marked as regent. Later on, they're depicted side by side as co-rulers. Eventually, Hatshepsut appears solo, sporting the false beard and royal gear of divine power, while Thutmose III fades from the records. For 15 years, she ruled as the absolute monarch, and during her reign, the vast territories didn't just survive, they thrived. Hatshepsut understood that successful expansionism needed more than just military might. While her predecessors took lands by force, she held them together through trade, diplomacy, and incredible construction projects that showcased the kingdom's wealth and sophistication. Her trading trip to Punt, celebrated in reliefs at Deir el-Bahari, brought back gold, ivory, incense trees, and exotic animals that highlighted the kingdom's international ties. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is considered one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. Built into the cliffs of the western bank, its terraced design fits beautifully with the natural landscape, creating stunning spaces. The temple wasn't just a royal vanity project. It was a bold statement of expansionist ideology, that the sovereign's divine nature could turn even the harsh desert into a paradise of beauty. However, Hatshepsut's peaceful reign was an exception in an era marked by constant warfare. When Thutmose III finally took full control around 1479 BC, he proved to be the greatest military genius in the kingdom's history. For the next 3 decades, he campaigned almost non-stop, transforming the loose collection of tributaries he inherited into a tightly controlled international system. The Battle of Megiddo, fought in his 22nd year on the throne, showcased both his tactical genius and the new reality of ancient warfare. The coalition of Canaanite cities that had revolted against traditional authority had armies equipped with the same bronze, weapons, and horse-drawn chariots that had once made the Hyksos unbeatable. But Thutmose's forces had learned from the past and improved on it. His composite bows had greater range, his chariots were more agile, and his infantry formations were more disciplined than anything his enemies could muster. More importantly, Thutmose knew that winning a battle was meaningless without a solid follow-up. After crushing the enemy coalition at Megiddo, he laid siege to the city for 7 months, making sure its surrender was complete and final. The wealth captured in that single campaign, 924 chariots, 2,238 horses, 200 suits of armor, and countless weapons funded further expeditions and sent a clear message to potential rebels about the futility of resistance. The administrative system that managed this vast international network was a marvel of ancient organization. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital, reveal a world of unprecedented complexity. Letters came from the leaders of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite state, addressing the monarch as brother and negotiating marriages, trade deals, and territorial disputes. Local governors from Palestinian and Syrian cities sent desperate pleas for military help against raiders or rival leaders. This correspondence shows that controlling distant territories wasn't automatic. It required constant attention and occasional military intervention. Provincial governors, many local chiefs who had submitted to traditional authority, were always testing the limits of their autonomy. Nomadic groups raided settled areas when military forces were busy elsewhere. Rival powers, especially the rising Hittite state, actively encouraged rebellion in border regions. Amenhotep II, Thutmose III's son, inherited this intricate system and kept it running through a mix of diplomatic skill and brutal suppression of rebellion. His victory stela at Karnak boasts about executing 7 captured princes with his own hands, then hanging their bodies from the walls of Thebes and Nubia to discourage future resistance. These displays of royal justice weren't just cruel. They were calculated political theater meant to maintain order across vast distances. The wealth that flowed into Thebes from these conquests transformed the ancient capital into the most magnificent city in the world. Karnak Temple, already impressive, became a sprawling complex of sanctuaries, courtyards, and monuments covering over 200 acres. The annual Opet festival, when the god Amun journeyed from Karnak to Luxor Temple, became a celebration of international glory that drew visitors from all over the known world. Amenhotep III, who took the throne around 1391 BC, inherited a dominion at the peak of its power and prosperity. His 38-year reign marked the golden age of ancient diplomacy and cultural achievement. The diplomatic correspondence from his time reveals a world where major powers kept the peace through carefully negotiated marriages, territorial agreements, and regular exchanges of gifts that were really just disguised tribute payments. The wealth at Amenhotep III's fingertips was almost unimaginable. Nubian gold mines provided a steady flow of precious metal that financed massive construction projects and diplomatic gifts. The Malkata Palace complex on the west bank of Thebes was larger than most contemporary cities, and even had artificial lakes for royal recreation. The mortuary temple he built for himself was the largest religious structure ever attempted, though only the famous colossi of Memnon, 2 seated statues, each weighing 720 tons, still stand today. But this prosperity also held the seeds of revolution. As the kingdom grew rich and secure, traditional religious beliefs faced pressure from fresh ideas brought in from conquered lands and allied powers. Solar worship, always a big deal in royal ideology, started to overshadow the local gods. Foreign deities, like the Asiatic Reshef and the Nubian Dadan, found their way into traditional temples. Most notably, the idea of a universal god who ruled over everyone, not just the valley civilization, began to resonate with leaders of a broader dominion. These religious tensions exploded into open revolution when Amenhotep III's son took the throne. At first, he ruled as Amenhotep IV, sticking to the conventional path by finishing his father's building projects and keeping up with traditional religious practices. But just a few years in, he launched into the most radical transformation seen in 3 millennia of civilization. This revolutionary leader changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, and declared that the solar disk, the Aten, was the one true god. All other deities were branded false, their temples shut down, and their images destroyed. For the first time ever, a ruler tried to impose monotheism on an entire civilization through royal decree. This religious revolution came with equally bold changes in art, architecture, and even the capital's location. Akhenaten ditched Thebes, home to the powerful Amun priesthood, and built a brand new city at what we now call Amarna. Here, in open-air temples, the royal family worshipped the sun disk in ceremonies that broke all the traditional rules. The art of Amarna, created to beautify the new capital, strayed far from the rigid styles that had defined artistic expression for ages. Instead of the usual idealized figures, Akhenaten commissioned portraits that showed him with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a prominent belly. Family scenes depicted tender moments, the sovereign kissing his wife or playing with his daughter's things. That would have been unthinkable in earlier times. But the revolution that started with so much promise ultimately ended in disaster. The religious shifts alienated the powerful priesthood that had supported the central administration for generations. The diplomatic letters from Amarna show a kingdom in crisis, with governors begging for military help that never arrived. The Hittites, sensing weakness, launched attacks that took over much of the Syrian territory Thutmose the Third had worked hard to secure. Most critically, Akhenaten's fixation on religion distracted him from the practicalities of running an empire. Provincial rebellions went unchecked, tribute payments were missed, and allied leaders started to question whether their protector could still protect them. The vast territories built over centuries began to crumble within just one generation. When Akhenaten died around 1336 BC, the establishment quickly moved to restore the old order. His young son-in-law, initially called Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun and left the heretical capital for Memphis and Thebes. This young king, likely no more than 9 years old, when he took power became the face of traditional restoration, even though real authority lay with military leaders and senior officials. Tutankhamun's short reign, he died around age 19, managed to accomplish the crucial task of restoring religion. The Aten temples were shut down, Amun's worship was reinstated, and the traditional priesthood regained their power. However, the vast territories remained weak and divided. The Syrian provinces were mostly lost, and the administrative system was shaken by a decade of religious chaos. The generals who helped bring back order after the chaos quickly grabbed power for themselves. I, who might have been Tutankhamun's granddad, ruled for a bit before Horemheb, the army commander who kept things in check during the religious upheaval, took over. Horemheb's 18-year reign wrapped up the counter-revolution, wiping out every trace of Akhenaten's religious ideas and putting the international system back on solid ground. But just restoring the old ways wasn't enough. It needed strong military leadership to win back lost territories and scare off potential threats. That's where the 19th dynasty came in, kicked off by the first Rameses, a military guy handpicked by Horemheb as his successor. The first Rameses and his son Seti I jumped into action, launching campaigns that re-established authority in the Levant. His war reliefs at Karnak show him capturing fortified cities, beating coalition armies, and getting local chiefs to submit who thought they could break free from traditional control. Most importantly, his campaign sent a clear message to the Hittite state. The ancient valley civilization had bounced back from its weak phase and was ready to take on anyone. But the real standout in this restoration was Seti's son, Rameses II, who ruled for an impressive 66 years and became one of the most famous kings in history. Rameses II knew that to dominate internationally, it wasn't just about military wins. It was also about keeping up a constant stream of propaganda that made enemies. Fear his power, and subjects respect his divine greatness. The Battle of Kadesh, fought in his 5th year as king against the Hittite army and its allies, became the highlight of this propaganda effort. Ramesses II's version of events, carved into temple walls all over the kingdom, tells a tale of a heroic victory against overwhelming odds. He claimed that, abandoned by his cowardly troops, he charged the entire enemy army all by himself and drove them away. But the reality was a bit different. Hittite records and detailed analysis show that Ramesses II fell into a well-planned ambush that nearly wiped out his army and should have ended his reign. Only the arrival of reinforcements and the Hittites' hesitance to follow through saved him. The battle ended up being a draw, leaving both sides exhausted and ready for peace. But Ramesses II spun this near disaster into a propaganda win that boosted his reputation. The peace treaty he struck with the Hittites 16 years later, the first documented international agreement, was framed not as a compromise between equals, but as the submission of enemies to his divine authority. The monuments Ramesses II built to celebrate his reign were bigger than anything his predecessors had created. Abu Simbel, carved into the cliffs by the sacred waterway near the Second Cataract, features 4 massive statues of the king, each 65 feet tall, guarding a temple decorated with scenes of his victories. The temple was designed so that twice a year, on his birthday and coronation day, the rising sun would shine into its depths, illuminating the statues of the king and the gods in the innermost sanctuary. At Thebes, Ramesses II expanded Karnak Temple with huge courts and halls, and he built his own mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, which features the largest and most detailed account of the Kadesh battle. All over the kingdom, from Nubia to the Lebanese coast, his monuments proclaimed his divine glory and royal power, reminding subjects of their obligations to their distant leaders. But maybe the most important legacy of Ramesses II was the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, where artisans who decorated royal tombs lived and worked for generations. The thousands of ostraka pieces of pottery and limestone flakes found there give us a unique look into daily life during this expansionist era. We see skilled craftsmen organizing strikes when their food rations were delayed, women managing household finances and property, and kids learning to read and write in schools connected to local temples. These records show that prosperity reached far beyond the royal court. The farmers, artisans, and administrators who supported the international system enjoyed living standards that wouldn't be matched in most parts of the world for another 2,000 years. Literacy was widespread, medical care was advanced, and social mobility allowed talented people to rise from humble beginnings to real authority. But the very success of Ramesses II's reign created challenges for his successors. He ruled until he was over 90, meaning several generations grew up knowing no other king. When he finally passed away around 1213 BC, the throne went to his 13th son, Merneptah, who was already old and faced the daunting task of living up to an impossible legacy. Merneptah's reign was filled with crises that showed just how much the world had changed during his father's long rule. The Sea People's mysterious maritime raiders, whose origins are still debated, launched brutal attacks on coastal cities across the eastern Mediterranean. Hittite power crumbled under their assault, creating a vacuum that let local chiefs in the Levant reclaim their independence. Even the heartland faced attacks as Libyan tribes, pushed out by drought and population pressure, invaded the western territories. Merneptah's victory over these Libyan invaders was the last great win of the expansionist age. His victory stela, carved at Thebes, contains the earliest known mention of Israel among the peoples of the Levant. But by then, the vast dominion was already starting its long decline that would eventually end its international dominance forever. The final chapter of international glory unfolded under Ramesses III, the last great warrior king, who faced a serious invasion by the Sea peoples around 1180 BC. These mysterious raiders had already taken down the Hittite state and wreaked havoc on coastal cities across the Levant. They weren't just warriors. They came as entire families, bringing their belongings in ox-drawn carts while their fleets attacked from the sea. The Battle of the Delta, vividly captured in reliefs at Medinet Habu, showcases Ramesses III's forces fighting fiercely to keep the invaders from settling in the heartland. Royal archers, positioned behind wooden fortifications, unleashed a storm of arrows on enemy ships, while infantry engaged the invaders on land. It was a complete victory. The Sea peoples were pushed back, and the kingdom was saved, but it came at a steep price. Things were looking grim. The Harris Papyrus, an economic document from the end of Ramesses III's reign, painted a picture of a kingdom in financial trouble. Temple estates had ballooned in size, controlling more wealth than the royal treasury itself. Corruption ran rampant, with officials pocketing funds meant for public works and military campaigns. Even the workers who built royal tombs went on strike when their food rations were diverted for private gain. The vast territories that once ruled the known world were now eating themselves alive from within. Provincial governors began acting like independent rulers, only sending tribute when absolutely necessary. Nubian gold production took a hit as mines ran dry and security crumbled. Trade routes that once brought exotic goods from afar shrank as political instability made long-distance commerce too risky. By the time Ramesses III passed away around 1155 BC, the golden age of expansion was winding down. His successors, kings who shared the same royal name but lacked his military prowess and political clout, watched as the empire slowly fell apart. Tiny provinces slipped away to local chiefs, and new powers emerged. Nubian governors declared their independence, and even in the heart of the kingdom, royal authority barely reached beyond the capital. As the last great king's tomb was sealed in the Valley of the Kings, the era of international dominance faded into an age of division and decline. Yet the monuments they left behind would ensure that their remarkable achievements would never be entirely forgotten. The silence that hung over Thebes after Ramesses III's funeral felt different from the respectful hush of past royal burials. This was a silence steeped in abandonment. The once great capital, which had commanded tribute from Nubia to the Euphrates, now found itself ruling little more than the surrounding countryside. The vast administrative system that had once overseen an international empire shrank down to managing local temple estates and collecting taxes from farmers who were becoming increasingly reluctant to pay. Power, like water seeking its level, flowed to whoever could claim it effectively. Up north, in Tanis, a family of military commanders established what they called the 21st Dynasty. These were practical folks who realized that the era of foreign conquest was over, and that survival meant adapting to new realities. They ruled effectively over the productive agricultural regions of Lower Kemet, keeping trade connections with the Mediterranean world and amassing impressive wealth despite their diminished circumstances. But Tanis faced a major challenge that would shape this entire period: legitimacy. The northern commanders might have controlled the richest agricultural lands and the most vital trade routes. But they had no ties to the ancient religious traditions that made kingship meaningful. They were successful warlords, ruling over territories they had taken, not divinely appointed sovereigns governing subjects who accepted their authority. True religious legitimacy remained in Thebes, where the high priests of Amun held both spiritual authority and temporal power. During the chaos of the late 20th dynasty, these priests managed the vast temple estates that spanned much of Upper Kemet, commanded the loyalty of local populations who revered Amun above any earthly ruler, and possessed the ritual knowledge necessary to maintain the cosmic order that kept the universe running smoothly. This led to an unprecedented split in authority. Tanis controlled the political and economic resources necessary for effective governance, while Thebes held the religious prestige that lent legitimacy to that governance. Neither could destroy the other without undermining their own power, so they coexisted in a shaky balance that lasted over a century. This division reflected deeper changes in society and culture. The rigid centralization that had defined the new kingdom gave way to a more federal system, where local authorities enjoyed considerable independence. Provincial temples, enriched by royal donations during the expansionist era, became centers of regional power with their own administrative systems and economic networks. Wealthy merchants and landowners, no longer reliant on royal favor for their prosperity, began to challenge traditional social hierarchies. Most notably, foreigners who had once been subjects or allies began to assert their own claims to leadership. In the Western territories, Libyan tribes settled as military colonists during the New Kingdom gradually rose to positions of authority. Their chiefs intermarried with local noble families, adopted traditional titles and religious practices, and slowly transformed themselves from foreign mercenaries into legitimate regional governors. This process peaked around 945 BC when Shoshenkai, a Libyan chief who had served as a military commander under the last Tanite sovereign, simply declared himself pharaoh and established the 22nd dynasty. His takeover was remarkably bloodless. The existing administrative system continued to function. Religious ceremonies proceeded without interruption, and most officials kept their positions under the new regime. Shoshenkai understood that successfully taking power required more than just seizing it. He had to show he could use it effectively. His solution was brilliantly simple. He would revive the military glory of the new kingdom through a spectacular foreign campaign that would remind both subjects and neighbors of traditional greatness. His target was the wealthy kingdoms of Palestine and Syria, now weakened by the collapse of their former protectors. The campaign, launched around 925 BC, was a masterpiece of logistics and propaganda. Shoshenq's forces swept through Palestine, capturing Jerusalem and dozens of other fortified cities. The biblical account, which refers to him as Shishak, describes the terror his appearance caused. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of the homeland, came up against Jerusalem. He took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. But Shoshenq's triumph revealed the limitations of this new age. Unlike the new kingdom pharaohs, who had established permanent control over conquered territories, he was satisfied with a massive raid that captured immediate wealth but created no lasting dominion. His forces returned home laden with gold and silver, prisoners, and tribute, but they left behind no garrisons, appointed no governors, and set up no administrative system that could turn military victory into political control. The wealth captured in Palestine funded a building program that decorated temples. throughout the homeland with scenes of Shoshenq's victories. At Karnak, his reliefs show him defeating enemies before Amun, while the god hands him the sword of victory. Long lists of conquered cities proclaim the restoration of traditional military prowess. But these monuments were more about propaganda than reality, impressive displays designed to convince viewers that the old greatness had returned when it had merely been briefly simulated. Shoshenq's successors lacked both his military skill and his political savvy. The 22nd dynasty splintered into competing branches, as different members of the Libyan ruling family established rival claims to authority. Some controlled Memphis and the northern territories, others ruled from Thebes, and still others carved out independent domains in the delta or central regions. By the 8th century, the unified state had become a patchwork of petty kingdoms, with boundaries shifting with each succession crisis. Amid this confusion, a new element emerged that would eventually reunify the fragmented territories: the rise of Nubian power in the south. The Kushite kingdom, centered at Napata near the Fourth Cataract, had been developing its own sophisticated political and religious system throughout the intermediate period. Kushite leaders adopted traditional religious practices, built temples in classical architectural styles, and created an administrative system modeled on New Kingdom precedents. Most importantly, the Kushite sovereigns preserved the ideology of divine kingship more faithfully than their northern counterparts. While Libyan chieftains ruled as successful warlords who happened to bear pharaonic titles, the Kushite leaders genuinely believed they were divinely appointed guardians of Ma'at, cosmic order, and traditional religious practices. They viewed the political fragmentation of the north as evidence of divine displeasure and their own rise as a mandate to restore proper governance. The Kushite advance northward was steady and unstoppable. Pi, the greatest of the Nubian rulers, spent years expanding his influence over Upper Kemet, using a mix of military strength and religious appeal. His victory stela, found at Jebel Barkal, gives us the clearest picture of the political and military happenings from this time. It shows Pi as a savvy political player who realized that real conquest meant more than just winning battles. When local chiefs surrendered to him, he kept them in their positions instead of replacing them with Kushite leaders. If cities gave in without a fight, he spared their people and safeguarded their belongings. When temples welcomed his troops, he made generous offerings and took part in traditional ceremonies to show he respected their beliefs. But Pi also knew that mercy needed to be backed by real power. Cities that resisted faced serious siege warfare, done with a professionalism that reminded people of the great conquerors from the New Kingdom. His account of the siege of Memphis reads like a military manual. Then he sent forth his fleet and his army to assault Memphis. They captured its harbor. They brought away its ships. They captured all the people who approached Memphis. The psychological impact of Kushite military efficiency was huge. Northern chiefs, used to the ritualized battles of the intermediate period, suddenly found themselves up against opponents who fought with deadly seriousness and had the skills to carry out long campaigns. One by one, cities submitted rather than face a siege from forces that clearly had the will and capability to crush any determined resistance. By 728 BC, Pi had control over nearly all the land south of Memphis. But instead of finishing his conquest by taking the delta regions, he chose to head back to Napata, satisfied with being acknowledged as the supreme ruler of the traditional heartland. This choice reflected both the practical limits of Kushite power and the ideological constraints of divine kingship. Pi saw himself as a restorer of traditional order, not a foreign invader, and that order required ruling from the ancestral centers of authority. The northern chiefs, left to their own devices, quickly resumed their petty conflicts and factional struggles. But now they faced a new threat that would force even the most fractious local warlords to seek outside help: the rise of Assyrian power in Mesopotamia. The Assyrian military machine, honed through centuries of constant warfare, was pushing westward into Syria and Palestine with a brutal efficiency that made all previous conquerors seem gentle by comparison. The Assyrian approach to conquest was fundamentally different from what had come before. Where earlier invaders were content to receive tribute and acknowledgement of their supremacy, the Assyrians sought total control by systematically destroying local cultures and deporting populations. Their siege tactics could turn the strongest fortifications to rubble. Their administrative system could convert conquered territories into Assyrian provinces. Most frighteningly, their commitment to expansion seemed to recognize no limits. As Assyrian forces conquered Syria and moved toward the traditional border regions, the northern chiefs faced an impossible choice: submit to a foreign domination more complete than anything they had ever known, or seek protection from the only power capable of challenging Assyrian military might. Reluctantly, they turned south to the Kushite rulers, who had shown their military effectiveness against traditional forces while still respecting local customs. Shabaka, Pi's successor, responded to these requests by finishing the conquest his predecessor had started. Around 715 BC, Kushite forces took Memphis and the Delta, gaining direct control over the entire traditional territory for the first time in over 3 centuries. However, Shabaka's unification was more about defense than aggression, a reaction to outside threats rather than a pursuit of internal ambition. The Kushite pharaohs, ruling from Memphis during the 25th dynasty, were remarkably successful in restoring traditional government and religious practices. They repaired temples that had fallen into disrepair during the intermediate period, re-established administrative systems that had been neglected, and revived artistic and architectural traditions that connected their reign to the glorious past. Taharqa, the greatest of the Kushite rulers, reigned for 26 years and proved that being from a foreign background didn't stop effective traditional kingship. His building projects rivaled those of the new kingdom pharaohs. His military campaigns spread influence into Palestine and Syria, and his religious activities won the devotion of priesthoods across the territory. Under his leadership, the reunited state briefly regained some of its former international prestige. But the Assyrian threat that had allowed Kushite unification ultimately proved too great. Esarhaddon's invasion in 674 BC was pushed back, but his second campaign in 671 BC succeeded in capturing Memphis and forcing Taharqa to flee south to Thebes. The Assyrian occupation was short but devastating. The invaders systematically looted temples, deported skilled craftsmen, and appointed local collaborators to manage territories they could not effectively control. Taharqa's attempts to reclaim the northern territories through alliances with Palestinian rebels only brought about even harsher Assyrian retaliation. Ashurbanipal's campaigns in 667 BC and 663 BC were carried out with a brutality designed to crush any future resistance. When Thebes finally fell to Assyrian forces in 663 BC, the ancient capital was utterly destroyed in a sack so complete that it became synonymous with devastation throughout the ancient world. The prophet Nahum, writing decades later, could still reference the fate of Thebes as the ultimate example of divine judgment. Are you better than Thebes that sat by the waterway, surrounded by water, whose rampart was the sea water? Her wall? Yet she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her infants were dashed in pieces at the head of every street for her honored men. They cast lots, and all her great men were bound in chains. The Kushite retreat to Napata marked the end of the last attempt to restore traditional greatness through foreign leadership. The 25th dynasty had shown that military effectiveness and religious orthodoxy could still command respect and loyalty, but they also revealed the impossibility of maintaining independence in a world dominated by Mesopotamian superpowers whose resources and organizational capabilities dwarfed those of any traditional African state. The Assyrian withdrawal, when it finally happened, was not due to local resistance, but rather political crisis in Mesopotamia that required the recall of forces from distant provinces. However, the brief occupation shattered the illusion that traditional military methods could compete with the systematic warfare of the new international age. The ancient territory emerged from Assyrian domination politically fragmented, economically devastated, and psychologically traumatized by the realization of its own vulnerability. Local chieftains who had collaborated with the Assyrians found themselves ruling territories whose populations despised them as traitors, while the conquerors had withdrawn beyond recall. Traditional authorities, who had remained loyal to the Kushite rulers, discovered that their leaders had retreated beyond the reach of effective support. Religious institutions that had maintained cultural continuity through previous periods of political chaos found their accumulated wealth plundered and their traditional practices disrupted. Yet even in this apparent ending, new forms of political organization were beginning to emerge that would eventually restore some measure of unity and prosperity. The trauma of foreign occupation had highlighted the shortcomings of traditional methods, but it also opened up possibilities for adaptation and renewal that would inspire the next chapter in the long story of civilization along the sacred waterway. From the ashes of Assyrian devastation, an unlikely phoenix would rise. In the bustling delta city of Sais, a local family of administrators who had worked under the Mesopotamian rulers started dreaming big like really big. They wanted to bring back the ancient glory by intentionally mimicking the past. Psamtik-I, the guy who kicked off the 26th dynasty around 664 BC, totally got that in this broken world. Legitimacy wasn't about inventing new stuff. It was about reviving traditions that felt timeless. Scholars later dubbed this movement a Saite Renaissance, where archaeology became a political tool. Psamtik's artisans meticulously studied Old Kingdom reliefs, copying poses and styles that hadn't been seen in 15 centuries. His architects rebuilt temples using blueprints from ancient archives, recreating sacred spaces that linked the present to a mythical golden age when divine rulers had a unified realm. But this wasn't just about digging up the past. Psamtik was smart enough to know that to truly restore things, he had to tweak those ancient forms to fit the modern world. While his monuments echoed the grandeur of pyramid builders, his administration brought in Greek mercenaries, Phoenician traders, and Mesopotamian diplomatic tricks. The trick was to look ancient while still being effective in a world that had changed so much. The reunification process was no small feat. It took decades and required a delicate balance between various competing forces. When the Assyrians pulled out, it left a power vacuum, but that also opened doors for ambitious local leaders across the valley. Psamtik had a smart game plan. He chose to bring these rivals into his fold instead of battling them. He offered them roles in his growing administration and gradually extended his influence through marriage alliances, religious appointments, and economic perks. The real turning point came when he took control of Thebes and appointed his daughter Nitocris as the divine adoratress of Amun. This role, which had evolved into a form of female leadership over Upper Kemet during the intermediate period, gave Psamtik a kind of religious legitimacy that no amount of military force could match. When the older Kushite princess who held the title adopted Nitocris as her successor, it pretty much sealed the deal on Nubian claims to authority. The adoption ceremony, beautifully detailed in inscriptions at Karnak, showed off the political savvy that marked Saite governance. Nitocris arrived in Thebes with a fleet of ships filled with gold, silver, and other treasures, a show of northern wealth meant to impress locals who had been through years of chaos and decline. Her formal adoption not only legitimized the power shift, but also allowed the previous regime to bow out gracefully instead of facing defeat. Under Saite rule, the reunified territories saw an incredible cultural and economic revival. The ancient capital of Memphis was not just rebuilt, but also brought back to life with new energy. Irrigation systems that had fallen apart during the intermediate period were restored and even expanded. Trade networks, which had shrunk during the Assyrian occupation, were reestablished, connecting the valley to Mediterranean markets and bringing an amazing boost in prosperity to merchant communities all over the realm. The Saite pharaohs were really good at handling the cultural mix that came with more foreign influences in their lands. Greek traders and mercenaries, drawn by economic opportunities and a stable political climate, set up permanent communities in the Delta cities. Instead of pushing back against this immigration, the Saite administration embraced it, giving the Greeks their own area in the city of Naucratis, while making sure they conducted all trade through official channels that benefited royal revenues. This smart approach to a multicultural society led to some fantastic cultural innovations. Greek artistic techniques blended with traditional sculpture and painting, creating unique styles that mixed classical proportions with ancient iconography. Foreign religious practices found their way into local ceremonies, expanding the pantheon without shaking the core theological beliefs. One of the biggest changes was the adaptation of the Greek alphabet for writing the local language, leading to the creation of the Demotic script that eventually took over from hieroglyphs for everyday use. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited during this time, shared detailed descriptions of a society that felt both fascinatingly ancient and surprisingly sophisticated. His accounts of mummification processes, religious festivals, and daily life give us invaluable insights into a civilization that was carefully preserving its traditions while also adapting to the times. His awe at the pyramids and temples shows just how much these monuments still inspired wonder, even among visitors from the most advanced Mediterranean cultures. But the Saite achievement also carried the seeds of its own downfall. The very success of their revival caught the eye of the Persian Empire, the latest and greatest of the Mesopotamian superpowers. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, realized that controlling the wealthy valley territories would not only provide huge resources, but also strategic control over eastern Mediterranean trade routes. The Persian invasion of 525 BC was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Cambyses knew that traditional military tactics had evolved to counter conventional armies, so he used methods specifically designed to play on local religious feelings. At the Battle of Pelusium, his forces supposedly drove cats ibises, and other sacred animals ahead of their advancing lines, knowing defenders would hesitate to harm creatures sacred to their gods. Whether this story is literally true or just symbolic, it highlights the fundamental challenge that Persian conquest posed. The Persians fought not just to defeat armies, but to break the religious and cultural beliefs that gave their enemies the will to resist. The victory was so thorough that Psamtik III, the last of the Saite pharaohs, was captured alive and forced to watch the execution of his son before being taken in chains to Persia. Persian rule, formalized as the 27th dynasty, turned out to be surprisingly adaptable to local conditions. Cambyses and his successors figured out that effective governance of the valley required respecting, rather than destroying, the religious and administrative traditions that made the region manageable. They took on traditional royal titles, participated in ancient ceremonies, and kept the temple estates that provided both religious legitimacy and economic productivity. Darius I, the best of the Persian administrators, showed this practical approach through massive infrastructure projects that benefited local people while serving imperial interests. His completion of the canal linking the valley to the Red Sea opened up new trade opportunities that enriched both the Persian treasury and local merchants. His legal reforms, recorded in both Persian and Demotic scripts, respected traditional laws while blending local practices into the imperial administrative system. But Persian rule, as enlightened as it seemed, was still foreign domination that many traditional elites just couldn't accept. The first serious rebellion kicked off in 486 BC, led by a local leader who claimed he was descended from the ancient pharaohs and promised to restore traditional independence. Although this uprising was quickly put down, it set a pattern for periodic revolts that would chip away at Persian control and eventually spark successful liberation movements. The game-changer came with Amartayus around 404 BC, who cleverly took advantage of the Persian distraction caused by Greek wars and internal succession disputes. This Saite prince managed to establish the short-lived 28th dynasty and held on to independence for 6 years before the Persians could regroup for reconquest. His success showed that, despite their might, Persian power wasn't unbeatable when stretched thin across vast distances and multiple fronts. Fast forward to the 30th dynasty, founded by Nectanebo I around 380 BC, which marked the last great era of native rule and ancestral culture. These final pharaohs understood that true independence needed more than just military might. It required some serious diplomatic finesse to navigate the tricky international landscape shaped by Persian-Greek conflicts. They formed alliances with Athens against Persia, hired Greek mercenaries to bolster their traditional forces, and built fortifications using the latest military engineering techniques. Nectanebo II, the last of the native pharaohs, ruled for 18 years and oversaw an incredible cultural renaissance that deliberately echoed the greatest achievements of the past. His ambitious building projects at temples throughout the valley showcased the wealth amassed during this independence period and a strong commitment to preserving traditional religious practices despite constant external pressures. However, this final independence was ultimately doomed by the very forces that had allowed it to flourish. The Persian Empire, having finally defeated Greek resistance, could now focus fully on conquering rebellious provinces. Artaxerxes III's invasion in 343 BC was marked by a brutal strategy aimed at discouraging future uprisings. Nectanebo II fled to Nubia, marking the end of over 3 millennia of continuous native rule. The Persians then established the 31st dynasty with administrative practices designed specifically to prevent future revolts. This second Persian occupation was short-lived but devastating. Determined to quash any chance of rebellion, the occupiers looted temple treasuries, deported skilled craftsmen, and destroyed fortifications that had previously supported resistance movements. The cultural and economic damage was so severe that when Alexander of Macedon arrived in 332 BC, he found a population eager to welcome any liberator who could promise protection from Persian retribution. Alexander's conquest was a whole different ballgame compared to previous foreign invasions. The young Macedonian didn't come in as a conqueror. He positioned himself as a liberator, sent by the gods to restore traditional order and kick out the despised Persians. His pilgrimage to the oracle of Amun at Siwa, where he was reportedly declared the god's son, showed a keen understanding of local religious beliefs and political needs. More importantly, Alexander had a vision of cultural synthesis that offered something groundbreaking: the chance to keep traditional identity alive within a cosmopolitan international framework. His foundation of Alexandria, at the mouth of the western branch, was a tangible representation of this vision: a city that would be both Greek and local, international and traditional, bridging the gap between ancient valley civilization and the broader Mediterranean world. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire was divided among his generals, with Ptolemy I taking control of the valley territories and setting up the dynasty that would rule for the next 3 centuries. The early Macedonian pharaohs were surprisingly good at adapting their administrative strategies to local conditions while maintaining the cultural blend that Alexander had started. One of the standout achievements of this Hellenistic period was the Museum and Library of Alexandria, which became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Scholars from all over the Mediterranean flocked there to study math, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, blending Greek methods with ancient knowledge preserved in old texts. Translating religious and scientific literature into Greek made this wealth of knowledge accessible to international scholarship, while ensuring its preservation for future generations. The most significant innovation was the creation of a truly bilingual culture that functioned effectively in both Greek and native languages. The Rosetta Stone, produced during Ptolemy V's reign, exemplifies this achievement: a royal decree published in hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Greek scripts, showcasing the administrative savvy needed to govern a multicultural population. This Hellenistic system allowed for incredible prosperity and cultural achievement for over 2 centuries. Alexandria became the largest city in the Mediterranean, bustling with ships from around the known world and streets packed with merchants, scholars, and artisans from a multitude of cultures. The wealth generated by this international trade not only funded military forces capable of defending independence, but also supported cultural projects that boosted the royal house's prestige throughout the Hellenistic world. Yet this success was ultimately undermined by the same forces that had derailed every previous attempt at independence: the rise of a new superpower with resources and organizational capabilities far beyond any regional state. The Roman Republic, having conquered the western Mediterranean, gradually extended its influence eastward through a mix of military intervention and diplomatic maneuvering that made formal conquest unnecessary until the very end. The last pharaoh, Cleopatra VII, understood that independence required not just legitimacy at home, but international alliances that could counterbalance Roman power. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were sophisticated attempts to maintain autonomy through partnerships. with Roman leaders who had both the resources and motivation to uphold a balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC didn't just signal the end of Ptolemaic rule. It marked the close of ancient independence that had persisted, albeit with brief interruptions, for over 3 millennia. Octavian's decisive victory over Antony and Cleopatra was so thorough that no future attempts at restoration would ever be possible. When Cleopatra chose to end her life, rather than face the humiliation of being paraded in a Roman triumph, she closed the final chapter of a saga that had begun with the unification of the two lands under Narmer. The sacred valley that had birthed pyramid builders, temple architects, and divine sovereigns was transformed into a Roman province, its wealth flowing north to fund imperial projects in far-off lands, with its ancient traditions preserved only in temples maintained for their tourist appeal rather than their religious significance.